of Send, the podcast. Today I'm joined by the lovely Philippa Stobbs OBE. If you don't know Philippa, Philippa's professional background is in teaching and school inspection work, working with the Council for Disabled Children, and in 1992 she founded the Special Educational Consortium to champion entitlement for children with SEN in the Education Act of 1993. Since then, she has led a growing policy consensus that has championed disabled children, young people, and those with SEN in Parliament with national government. She has designed and created highly successful partnership projects developing inclusion with local authorities, parent carer groups, the voluntary sector, schools, and early years settings. She has produced a wide range of guidance and materials explaining complex legislation in practical terms. She's designed and developed and led a multi-level DfE-funded early years SEN and disability national partnership programme from 2016 to 22. Philippa professional advisor from 2008 to 2010, and since then she's continued to advise the DfE, so the Department for Education, on a wide range of policy areas, including funding, assessment and disability discrimination. She was appointed as the National Coordinator for England with the European Agency for Special Educational Needs and Inclusive Education for 2014 to 2022. Philippa has nationally recognised expertise and until her recent retirement led the education work at the Council for Disabled Children, or CDC, as Assistant Director based at the National Children's Bureau. She continues to work on a number of projects as a CDC associate and independently for other organisations. She recently completed a series of 6 guides on the disability duties in the Equality Act of 2010 for early years settings, schools and further education colleges. The guides were commissioned by the DfE and are published on the CDC website. In 2022, she won the Nason Person Award of the Year Award, and in 2023 was awarded an OBE for services to disabled children. I mean, that is incredible, Philippa. It's a huge array. I've known you for a number of years, and I've always said, thank you for everything that you do for our children. It's astonishing. So thank you for that, and thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Tina. And it's a great pleasure to join you for this discussion about reasonable adjustments. I mean, they are so important to the inclusion of children, disabled children in our schools, and to their inclusion in the whole life of the school. And that, in a sense, is one of the most challenging things for schools, to ensure that disabled children are able to participate in their life at school. Reasonable adjustments are absolutely key in that. Now, sorry, I've already said schools, and of course, disabled children and young people are not just in schools; they're in early years settings, and they're in FE colleges, and they're in all sorts of programs outside that. And the duties that we're going to be talking about today, they apply to all those different settings. But I'm going to focus on schools in what I say, because the duties apply slightly differently to early years settings and to FE colleges. But Tina, one of the last bits in what you said about me, the white hair attests to the fact that I've been around for a bit of time. So all the information about the duties is fairly clearly articulated in that series of CDC guides that were commissioned by the DfE. They're all on the CDC website. So I think just to say that, of course, in our discussion today, we'll touch on all sorts of things that are perhaps got some important technical underpinning, and that's where anyone who's watching or listening to this podcast can go to check on any of the detail or to follow up with questions they may have about reasonable adjustments. But I thought it might be helpful, I mean, subject to what you think, Tina, I thought it might be helpful to have a slightly sort of more general discussion about reasonable adjustments in this first podcast, and I know we're going to follow up with the next one where I thought we might
go. We're doing 2 episodes of this.
Yeah,
because it's such an important subject, and we're doing two episodes. So I think it's really wise how you've broken it down of the general conversation and then the technicalities in episode 2.
Yeah, so I think things like the definition of disability we'll probably want to cover in the second podcast, because it's not to diminish its importance. It's really, really important that anyone who's watching or listening to this podcast understands something about the breadth of the definition, but we will go into that in more detail in the second episode. This is series 1, episode 1.
It is
as series it were.
1. No, but it is, isn't it? It's such a massive subject matter that there's just no way we could have done it any justice, or explained it to everybody in just one episode, because it's just huge. And what we don't want to do is give a little bit of information and then stop it and not have any more information. Then people going, well, I'm no wiser to what I was to begin with. I'm a bit more confused. So that's why we're doing it in the 2 episodes, which was such a good idea to do. And I'm glad that you talked about the differences, that that we're going to focus on schools, because that actually is the longest time most children are in education, is in the school system. And early years and FE is slightly different, but there will be some things that will apply, or most things will apply, won't there, in those settings. It's not just, well, it's different for FE and it's different for early years. There is some commonalities across the board, isn't there?
Yeah. Reasonable adjustments duty applies to early years schools and FE, but even within reasonable adjustments, the duties apply slightly differently. So it's important for anyone whose child is in an early years setting, or whose older child is in FE, that they look at the slightly different way in which those duties apply. But all of our educational institutions are required to make reasonable adjustments.
And I think the next question then is, so what is a reasonable adjustment? I mean, we talk about it all the time, and it's come up fairly recently in the news outlets around the politician, and I'm not going to name him, who sort of made a comment around an autistic child was wearing ear defenders, and he made a comment, and that in itself is a reasonable adjustment to do with that particular child and maybe the condition. So if we ignore, that, well, not ignore it, but just if we push that to one side and we look at reasonable adjustments as a whole, what is a reasonable adjustment? Do you want to explain what one is?
Well, it's the changes or the adjustments that we make to our school policies and practices that enable disabled children to participate in the life of the school. It's also the main way in which we avoid and prevent discrimination against disabled pupils. So it's really important that we know enough about reasonable adjustments to know that we have to think about them in advance of a situation arising. Because if we wait until something has put a disabled pupil at a substantial disadvantage, we'll talk more about substantial later, but it's actually relatively low threshold. So we can quite easily put a disabled pupil at a substantial disadvantage compared with their peers if we don't make a reasonable adjustment. So we have to think about the situation where that might happen, and then the reasonable adjustment is what we do to make sure that it doesn't happen. So we have to think about them in advance. And that's the first challenge, I think, for schools, but they are things which are reasonable for a school to have to do. And again, we'll talk more about what's reasonable later. And I think you've had a question about that, Tina, haven't you? What is it reasonable for a school to do? But just to say at the outset, most of the things that constitute a reasonable adjustment are small changes to practices and policies that very often cost nothing in terms of money, but they do require schools to understand why they need to change something they do and why it's essential to ensuring that all children can participate in across the life of the school. So we might want to talk a bit more about some of the practicalities in a moment, but there is very much a sense that making reasonable adjustments really has to exist within a whole school approach to this. And I think perhaps towards the end of this podcast, we maybe come to thinking about the whole school approach and the values associated with that whole school approach, so that it is not the duty of any one individual teacher. The overall responsibilities sit with the governors of school governors and academy trustees for making sure that everyone within the school understands the duties and is applying them appropriately. So there are other duties in the Children and Families Act, for example, that require schools to make sure that children with special educational needs are joining in all the activities of the school with their fellow pupils. So this doesn't sit on its own, but yet it sits at the heart of how we can make sure disabled children are included in the whole life of the school.
And I think, listening to that and, from a school's perspective, I guess one of the questions that would happen is, how would you know a child is disabled and it falls within the Equalities Act? Because not every child with a special educational need will fall into that disability bracket. And so would they need to check if they're not sure? Or do you think that it's better just to do reasonable adjustments for all of the classroom? Because it is an ethos, isn't it? It's not just action for one particular child necessarily. It is, like you say, it's around policies, which everybody follows and they're put into place to follow. But you do need to sort of look at the duties around the Equalities Act, the disability discrimination within that, to then make sure that your policies that you're running alongside fits in with those descriptors almost, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, the first thing to say is that schools don't have to know that a child is disabled. In fact, they may not know that a child is disabled, but they need to act on information that may lead them to believe that that child could be disabled. And this is quite difficult for schools, but you only know if a child is disabled if a claim of discrimination goes to the tribunal, because the tribunal then determines whether that child is covered by the definition in the Equality Act or not. And I think that, therefore, it's a good idea for schools to act on the basis of the information that they have, and that they are sort of deemed to know that a child may be disabled if any information has come to them that might suggest they could be disabled under the definition in the Equality Act. So, for example, if they know that a child has got a special educational need and observation of them in the classroom suggests that there may need to be some adjustments made for that child, the school is deemed to know that that child could be disabled if they observe a child with a special educational need who may be struggling with some aspects of the life of the school. So I think it's schools are well advised to, as it were, overgeneralize. The risk, I think, is rather on the other foot, that schools may not understand the breadth of the definition. And the risk is that schools may discriminate where they don't recognise that that child might be disabled. And there are some examples that I'll come to in a minute where the school didn't think of a child as being disabled, and they did discriminate because they didn't see him as being disabled. They knew that he had a special educational need. But we'll come to that in a minute, because that really broadens out to areas of school life where we need to understand the basics of the reasonable adjustments duty first, perhaps. So do you think it might help if I talked about some of the very simple adjustments that we might make for children who are disabled, and the school may reasonably assume are disabled because they have information about a special educational need, or about a medical condition, or they may, by observation, notice that a child may be struggling with certain aspects of school life. So suppose I give some simple examples first, and then we go on to the things that become more sort of emotionally charged around children's behaviour. So, for example, it might be that a student with a vision impairment needs to be seated at the back of the classroom to enable her to have that, to have her field of vision accommodated. That's not an assumption anyone would necessarily make if they knew that a child had a vision impairment, but therefore it's quite important to have a discussion with the student themselves, or with their parents, carers, their wider family, about what adjustments they might need to the school day. And we'll talk more in a minute about how you might go about that. But it might be a small adjustment to a timetable, for example, to allow a pupil with a learning difficulty to have some reinforcement activity. It might be a pupil with dyslexia who needs a little more time to complete a task, but so that teachers have a prompt for that, that pupil is given a green card or some kind of signal that they can indicate to the teacher they need more time to complete the task they've been set. It might be a child needs movement breaks during an activity to enable them to continue to concentrate on the task they've been set. And that would be, that is likely to be a reasonable adjustment. And some classrooms, that may generate difficulties and questions about fairness from other children. Why is he allowed to go and sit over there and roll around on a large exercise ball, and I have to stay sitting here? And I think that is where we get into school values, and where an acceptance of difference and different treatment can help by not singling particular children, individual children out, but by a wider recognition across the life of the school that actually difference is, if you like, an asset to humanity, it's fundamental to humanity, and different treatment therefore is accepted widely across the school. So I think, again, we can talk about the practicalities of the duties and how they work, but actually the smooth running of the school is dependent really on the acceptance of that need for different treatment. And the acceptance of that makes it much easier to make those adjustments. Shall I move on to sort of how things can go wrong, perhaps, when
Yeah,
schools don't see the need for a reasonable
yeah,
adjustment.
I just wanted to sort of because you've explained very eloquently around, movement breaks, sitting on a yoga type ball or a peanut in order for the sensory needs, and you're right. We gathered or we asked for questions before we do the podcast episodes. I ask and send out forms links for anybody to fill in, and we always get anonymous feedback or questions back. And you're right, we had a couple around, the reasonable adjustments, and it's really quite interesting because one of the questions was that, how they even have this on a basic level. It's just one thing to think about. The other, one of the other questions was that, they have no extra funding, so the demands that's received often, sometimes from parents, sometimes from Senko or whatever, the pressure and the barriers, about making reasonable adjustments. But what you've just explained is that they cost very little money. They shouldn't take up too much time. There is a little bit of time element, I suppose, to put it in place, but you could, have regular sort of breaks, stand-up breaks, so you're not sitting down all the time in a classroom environment, rather than just singling out one child, which might take an extra member of staff or whatever. So there is those reasonable adjustments that can be put in place that really are very cost effective to do not take much time to plan, because we know that PPA time for staff is, everything is crammed in, and they do work outside of school hours as well. So it is, a reasonable adjustment really is something that really shouldn't take up huge amount of time. I mean, there might be some things that you need to put in place for a child, for them to be able to, be, go around school and make the school accessible. But then that's not necessarily a reasonable adjustment. That is an adjustment for that particular child's needs and disabilities. What we're talking about is the small things within a classroom environment that can really make a difference for all of the children that attend, not just one.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important to focus a little bit on that word reasonable. What is it reasonable for a school to do? And you're absolutely right. Most of the things I've mentioned so far cost little or nothing and actually enable classrooms, the whole school, to run more smoothly, and so therefore take up less time in other ways. An interesting example for me was a large secondary school who were having constant problems and a lot of staff time taken up with infringements to the uniform policy. So staff were taking up a lot of time in corridors, saying, you need to button up your shirt, or where's your tie, or where's your jacket, and uh, 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 this was, it was observed to actually be taking up a significant amount of staff time. So the leadership of the school was aware that there were some reasonable adjustments being made for individual pupils as well. Pupils who, through their reaction to either colour or fabrics, needed alternative uniform. So what they did was they consulted on some small changes to the uniform policy, which gave a slightly wider range of options for pupils. And the impact of implementing those changes, which were, I was going to say, uniformly welcomed. Sorry. The impact of implementing those changes was that actually staff experience was of more positive working relationships with people, because they were they didn't have that sort of disciplinary bit of the interaction, because the adjustments to the overall policy meant that the choices meant that there was no problem for all the pupils then complying with the uniform policy. It was as though the removal of those barriers actually gave the school a new burst of positive life and an acceptance that actually that was fine. It didn't undermine anyone's ability to learn and make progress in their academic work. It did, it was just one of those things that was a daily irritation. So some of those adjustments, in that case, a change made to whole school policy to reduce the need for multiple individual adjustments, actually made for a better school life all round. Of course,
And
there were
that's
all
the
sorts of other
yeah,
things
and
that,
that's the thing, isn't it? Is that if you look at some of the reasonable adjustments in place, if you did it as a whole school thing, it's one less thing to think about because everybody's doing it. It makes the school run more seamless because you're not worried about, somebody not doing anything or not wearing a tie or whatever it may be. And so therefore it makes the staff more relaxed because they're not having to chase their tails all the time because it's hard, being in the classroom. So before we touched on that sort of example, you were going to talk about what has gone wrong. What sort of things have you come
yeah.
across in your time that's made you, and there has been some case law around these things as well through the tribunals, hasn't there, around discrimination and things.
Yeah,
But
there's some
what's the
case
key
law
things?
recently.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if I'll take a sort of an example of a case, a very early case that went to the tribunal, just to highlight some of the issues about acceptance of difference, if that's okay with you. And then I'll move on to the ones that are more about behaviour, where if we understand the principles of making adjustments and understand some of the challenges for schools and for teachers, parents, and pupils, if we understand that a bit, then I'll move on to the ones that become, which are much more emotive, and I'll refer to that case law, which also has implications for the definition of disability as well. So one of the early cases of discrimination that went to the tribunal was about a child who has diabetes who was in a primary school, and she needed a sort of high calorie snack in the middle of the day, which clashed rather with the school's healthy snacks policy. So in the playground, all the snacks were to be, fruit or approved snack, fruit and veg, apples and carrots, let's just say for now. And the child with diabetes was sent to sit outside the head teacher's office to have her high calorie snack. Now, okay, so that was found to be discriminatory because, one, it deprived her of her recreational time with her friends, her fellow classmates at playtime, but also it discriminated in as much as, the signal to everyone else was that she'd misbehaved because that's where you went to sit if you'd been naughty. So, you say, well, obviously the reasonable adjustment would be that she's allowed to eat her high calorie snack in the playground with her peers. And then put yourself in the position of the break time supervisor and other kids saying, hold on a minute, why is she allowed to have crisps and biscuits when we're only allowed to have apples and carrots or whatever it was. Now, in practice, my observation would be that children, and particularly young children, accept difference very readily. I think in that situation, it's the adults who are likely to find that more difficult. And I think it comes back to an acceptance of difference and different treatment, which is more difficult for adults to absorb than it is for children. That would be my observation. So I think it requires of that break time supervisor to be able to explain to other children that she has to have a high calorie snack now to keep her healthy and to prevent her from becoming unwell. And to keep us healthy, we need to have the fruit and veg snacks that help to keep us healthy. And then children accept that very readily. And I'm reminded of a parent who at the school gate was told by her child that another child had a seizure in the classroom, and the mother of this observer child went to the mother of the child who'd had that epileptic seizure in the classroom and said, "Oh, what happened? What happened? Your child had a seizure." And her daughter turned to say, "Mum, it's okay. We know this happens, and we know exactly what to do when it happens. We don't panic, Mum. It's all right." And there is an acceptance on the part of children that is perhaps more difficult for adults to accept. So I think that's a sort of a starting point. We need to understand this isn't necessarily straightforward for schools to accept and understand its importance. But if we moved on to an example where it's a behaviour issue at stake, and I think this is where, because there is so much more emotion around this, it's important to remember the principles of making a reasonable adjustment. So this is another case that went to the tribunal. A pupil with a communication difficulty was asked by a teacher arriving in the classroom. He was standing near the door, and he was asked by the teacher coming into the classroom, "Are you going to sit down?" Well, from his point of view, at that moment, he had no intention of sitting down. So he replied no. And the incident escalated to the point where he swore at the teacher quite colourfully. It was reported in detail in the report of the tribunal. So the school's policy was a 2-day exclusion for any pupil who swore at a teacher. Now, in practice, the school had failed to make a reasonable adjustment for that pupil in the way that the teacher interacted with the child. Now, further complicated by the fact this was a supply teacher arriving in a classroom. She'd not taught before, and she'd not been briefed about the nature of the child's communication difficulty. The school was found to have discriminated, but let's backtrack and see what should have happened. Well, number one, of course, all teachers should have been briefed about understanding how they needed to communicate with that pupil. So communicating in simple, clear instructions, ideally using his name at the start of that instruction to secure his attention, and a simple instruction to sit down, and none of that would have happened. That adjustment had not been, or the need for that adjustment had not been communicated to that teacher. So it goes beyond actually recognizing what adjustments are needed. It's making sure those adjustments are communicated to all the people who might be interacting with that pupil. But the adjustments go beyond that. The schools may need to make an adjustment to their policies, their exclusion policies, where something has gone wrong in that way, and where ultimately underlying it, the adjustment was not made for that child, then they may also need to make an adjustment to the exclusion policy, perhaps providing an internal exclusion. Clearly, you need to send a signal to the other pupils in that class that that behaviour is unacceptable, but the response to that needs to be proportionate. So for this pupil, an internal exclusion might be the way that the schools could adjust that policy. But the whole bit around what schools are going to observe as a behaviour difficulty, that response to that teacher at the classroom door was observed and experienced as a behaviour difficulty. So we need to understand a little bit more about behaviour difficulties. And a number of issues arise. One, a school seeing that incident at the door may regard that as being a disciplinary issue. That's a badly behaved child. Whereas in practice, it's the response of a disabled pupil with a communication difficulty to something that the teacher said that because of his communication difficulty, he didn't understand. So recognizing that that is a reflection of an underlying impairment of a disabled pupil is, if you like, step one. Recognizing that some schools may see that child as having a tendency towards physical abuse, even if that incident had gone beyond a verbal exchange and had become a physical, which it risked doing, evidently, then in the past, that might have excluded that child from the definition of disability, because there are some exclusions from the definition. A tendency to physical abuse excludes someone from the definition of disability. So it's important to know that a decision by the upper tribunal confirmed that a child in education is not exempt from the definition where their behaviour arises from their disability. So that incident escalated because of the nature of the child's underlying disability. Had it gone further, become a behaviour issue where it became a physical or violent encounter with that teacher, the need to make reasonable adjustments does not evaporate where the behaviour that arises is based on the nature of the child's disability. So it's important to recognise the breadth of the definition, the fact that for children in education, a tendency to physical abuse does not exempt them from the definition of disability, and we therefore need to make reasonable adjustments. And a failure to see a child as possibly being disabled is one of the easiest ways in which schools may inadvertently discriminate. One school said at the tribunal, this is a child who had a known special educational need and who was regularly getting into difficulties with the disciplinary system in the school. And one of the teachers giving evidence at the tribunal said, we didn't see him as disabled, we just saw him as a mainstream kid. In other words, a child who was misbehaving rather than who was acting in a way that was linked back to the nature of his disability. So it's really, really important to understand, yes, the breadth of the definition, but the significance of that duty to make reasonable adjustments so that we don't discriminate against disabled pupils.
And it's really important, isn't it, that, the majority of children with SEN are in our mainstream settings. And, and I suppose even in specialist provision, you have to make reasonable adjustments in anything that we do. But it is, isn't it? It's that complication, I guess, for staff and schools to understand, you know, to take an example and, of a child who has got behaviour that's difficult to manage, and if, pushed into a situation, might act out, even, not physical with staff, but maybe, pushing a chair over, or, throwing pens across the classroom, just because their ability to come into into school has been hindered. You've got children maybe with anxiety, and the way that comes out is that they then can't articulate what they're feeling, and will just push a chair over or throw a pen, or, and there is clear guidance about how that young person comes into school. If you don't follow it through, if you do not allow that child to come into school that has been agreed, mainly because of staff shortages, maybe because of supply teachers, if you're not following through what you've agreed, that is, discrimination. If you're then going to, exclude or suspend a young person that's within the policies because those reasonable adjustments have been set out and you've not followed them through, it's then very difficult, isn't it, for a family to then understand the conversations. And I suppose you've sort of said all the way along, it's around communicating as a whole. The example of the child with the high energy snack, there's a piece of work there with other children around, for some children, they can't just eat fruit, they have to eat something else. It's to do, to keep them healthy. Fruit is healthy, but for this young person or this child or your friend, they need something else to be to healthy. So it is that communication, isn't it? It's that conversation that sometimes doesn't happen, which is why things do end up in tribunals around discrimination.
Yeah, it's quite a small number of claims of discrimination that go to the tribunal. It's a very significant step for a parent to take to make that claim to the tribunal, because parents naturally worry, well, what how will the school respond to me, to my child, if I make this claim to the tribunal? And that is very, very difficult for parents to actively make a claim. It's very different from an SEN appeal, where a proposal comes to the parents about what we're going to do, and parents may or may not like it, but they have a way to the tribunal to articulate their disagreement with the proposal. But it's in response to something they've been given. Now, this requires parents to actively go to the tribunal. Without that trigger, what's happened in school, yes, but there is nothing that's been sent to the parent. It requires the initiative of the parent. And so it's really important that parents are aware of sources of local support who can provide some help and support in understanding what they may be able to achieve. But it's everything under the reasonable adjustments duty is what is reasonable to do. Schools are not asked to do anything that is unreasonable, it's overly costly or difficult. We might perhaps in the next podcast talk a little bit more about some guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission about what's reasonable. But I think overwhelmingly, the ease with which schools can make reasonable adjustments is dependent on a whole school approach on a whole school understanding of the fact that difference it's part of the human condition, and we need to understand children where they are, not necessarily where our tests and assessments would like them to be, that we understand that that difference may require different treatment, and an acceptance of that by and large across a whole school makes it just so much easier to make those adjustments and to notice when they've stopped working. You know, you might make a reasonable adjustment today that works. It might then, after a while, perhaps for some reason it stops working. And so it does need to be kept under review. But it's important that, children, young people themselves are involved in thinking what adjustments are going to be effective. And that's one of the things that the EHRC says, a reasonable adjustment needs to be effective. If you involve children, young people themselves in thinking about what's going to make this work better, then those adjustments are much more likely to go on being effective, and often very small adjustments. And one head of English in a secondary school was finding it very difficult that one of the pupils with a very short attention span was often seeking attention in ways that were very disruptive to the class. And she sat down at the end of one lesson and said, look, no, this is not working for me, it's not working for you, and it's not working for the rest of the class either. What can we do? How can we help you? And they came to an agreement about a reasonable adjustments, which, when I saw the teacher a year later, was still working, and the difficulty had evaporated, and it was generally accepted that this particular pupil had a short conversation with the teacher at the end of the lesson when things worked well, and that gave the pupil and the teacher and the rest of the class the assurance that there would be less disruption. So I think when we need to think about what's going to be effective, the involvement of children or people themselves in that discussion is an important element in it. But I come back to the fact that that happens so much more readily in a school that accepts difference, understands the need for different treatment, and, if you like, that values all pupils equally, welcomes all pupils equally. And that, I think, parents' experience is not of that equal welcome. And I think that may mean that parents are reluctant to share information about their child, and that's information that might be useful to the school, but they may be reluctant to share information about their child because they fear they may be encouraged to seek a place at a different school. There is evidence from the Children's Commissioner of that happening, and happening more to disabled children and children with special educational needs than it does to their peers. So that's a problem for parents, where actually they might otherwise be willing to share information with the school that would enable the school to make a better fist of reasonable adjustments for their child. And that further complicates the school's understanding of which children may count as being disabled. So there are this idea about a whole school approach and valuing all children equally. It might seem like a bit of a fringe issue. It's fairly fundamental to schools' ability to be able to respond appropriately to children who are disabled, who need that different treatment.
For absolutely sure. And I think, you know, that it goes back to that communication, and you're right around, you know, parents not talking around their child and their you know different needs. And the Children's Commissioner, who, you know, has reported such cases, and there was a Sky News report actually that was issued last week around home education, and the figure is home educated in England, and you know one of the factors of that, you know, I think it's about a quarter of them have got SEN, and it's the, you know, that choice of, you know, it's some in some cases it's not electively home education, it's home education that they haven't got a choice about, and that's from experiences of families that I've spoken to. um Philippa, very quickly before we end this episode of this podcast, because we're going to do another episode around getting into it a little bit more detail. um but if a family is listening to this and thinks, actually, that is exactly what happened with my child, you know, they're in the current school, they've communicated with the school and nothing's happening, and the child is being excluded for various reasons, and the parents thinking, well, actually, I think this could be discrimination. Could a family go to tribunal if the child has no EHCP, but they think that there is some discrimination here?
Absolutely. An EHCP is not a badge that says this child is disabled. And we'll perhaps talk in the next podcast a bit more about the definition, the breadth of it. But that said, a child with an EHCP is more likely to meet the criteria in the definition, simply because their special educational need has warranted an assessment and an EHCP. So an EHCP is not a signal, but if a parent thinks their child, whether with an EHCP or not, may have been discriminated against, they can, of course, go directly to the tribunal. It takes quite a lot for a parent to do that. We talked about that a moment ago. But the local SENDIAS service, the SEN and Disability Information Advice and Support Service, would be a really good place to go and have an initial discussion. And it might help a parent to understand whether they may have a good basis for a claim or not. And it also, they're a very good place to go to, just for a parent to chew over what has happened and to think with someone else whether whether they ought to take a claim to the tribunal, or indeed whether there may be some other way of resolving it, in perhaps working with the school. So I do think SENDIAS service is a really good place for the parent to go. Even if, you know, if the relationships with the school are currently reasonable, despite parents thinking that they may be discriminated against, talking to the SENCO or to someone with an inclusion brief in the school might be a first step. But if working relationships have dropped below a threshold where a parent felt able to do that, then I would definitely consider talking to the local SENDIAS service. Most of them have had training on the disability duties in the Equality Act, and have access to training on the disability duties. So I think that would be a sensible first step, just to be able to chew it over with someone else who's outside the situation.
Yeah, no, I agree. Thank you so much for doing this episode. As you said, we're going to do another episode which we're going to get into more depth. So hopefully this has been a really good starter for people to listen to, and then they'll come and find the second episode, which we will get into the more sort of beefy area of reasonable adjustments. Thank you again, Philippa, for joining me on this podcast.
Oh, thanks for inviting me, Tina. Thanks.